Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hi there, welcome again. Let's welcome you formally to this ongoing discussion on elements of fiction. It's a continued class from the previous discussion. Please recall whatever quickly you learnt about the various elements. We discussed plot, and of course we applied all of them brilliantly, and what was interesting is you picked almost all of them very intuitively and also learnt how to apply them to a given short story, an anecdote, or even a novel, because of course as I said, if you know how to apply it to this short story, you definitely know how to apply it to a novel as well. Why do we need to know all these things? Of course, when you are analyzing a work of fiction in a proper methodic way, you need to analyze it from various elements that constitute fiction. So, this indicates an heightened awareness about the genre called fiction, and as a student of literature it also shows, of course there must be a difference between a layperson describing a novel that he or she has read and you describing a novel that you have read, right? That is the distinction, because you are more informed of those features that constitute fiction, and because of this it gives you a kind of a leverage. In case you choose to write a novel, you can leverage your understanding of all these elements, and therefore you can as well begin writing a novel. Okay, yeah. Now let us begin a discussion of various elements. Before that, let us quickly recall those elements of fiction that we discussed in the previous class. We began with plot, okay, right? We discussed plot, then we began with conflict, then you have characters, then you have setting, then you have theme, style, point of view, and of course tone. All these things we discussed very briefly. Now we are going to take them up in a little more detailed manner. So the first element of fiction is plot. Plot occupies a major role in fiction, whether it is a short story or a novel. Plot is very, very important. Okay. So when in a novel, it's actually fiction is woven around a plot. In other words, it's like a seed. Plot is like a seed, and like everything is wrapped around the seed, fiction is woven around that plot. That's the bare minimum. Plot is the bare minimum that you need to work out. So it's an essential element of a fiction, and we already discussed this. Though there are a couple of theorists or critics who distinguish story from a plot, well, the modern theorists consider story as an integral component of plot, but critics such as E.M. Foster in his very important work called Aspects of the Novel. In fact, if you are a little more serious about various the elements that constitute fiction, that is one important book that you can always refer to, Aspects of the Novel. And in fact, our discussion, subsequent discussion of various elements is also based on our understanding of the text. And if you are further interested, you can also check up The Art of Fiction, that's by Milan Kundera. Through series of interviews, Milan Kundera, one of the contemporary heavyweights of fiction, you can call him that, discusses his craft, and not just his craft, the craft of fiction in a little more elaborate way. The Art of Fiction, these are two things that you can refer to, Aspects of the Novel by E.M. Foster, Art of Fiction by Milan Kundera. Okay, yeah. So E.M. Foster distinguishes plot from a story. Story is a sequence of events as it happens chronologically. He gives you even a famous example, right? The king died, and the queen died. That's the story. Now, where does the plot come in? If you add the king died and the queen died of grief, then it becomes a plot. Now, what has happened, you have added to the element of story, because the story is the king died and the queen died. Even in the plot, that story is there, but along with the story there is an addition of the cause, the causal factor, right? Why some things have happened in a way they have happened, why certain things have happened the way they have happened. There must be a cause for this particular effect. Therefore, you can say that the king died and unable to withstand the grief, the queen died. That becomes a perfect plot. But in other words, for our understanding, we can say that story plus cause constitutes plot. Okay. So, it is a sequence or series of events that happen in a novel. What happens, when it happens, and why does this happen? So, generally these are the things that you concern with. What happens, right? And in order to answer the question when happens, you need to put the sequence, chronology of events, and then why does that particular thing happen, the reason behind that. So, that constitutes the plot. Generally speaking, a plot follows a narrative arc. It is said, what is this narrative arc? We are going to discuss in a short while. Or a dramatic structure. It follows a certain arc, okay, or a dramatic structure. And today we call that Freytag's pyramid. Freytag was a well-known German playwright who first identified this structure, and then based on his structural understanding of the genre, we now apply it across every fiction or every genre of fiction that has an element of plot. So, the moment you talk of plot, you talk of a narrative arc which follows a particular way or a dramatic structure. So, there are 5 stages in which a plot is taken. Of course, this Freytag's pyramid talks of the development of the plot in 5 stages. The 5 stages through which a plot develops in fiction is called, the arc, the narrative arc. They are exposition, that is the first one, rising action, second one, climax, third, falling action, the fourth one, and resolution, or the French word for that is denouement, denouement. It is called a resolution. How is this conflict or resolved finally? That is the 5 structures. Let us take a quick look at how it happens using a short illustration. Here is an illustration. I am sure you can see this here. Here is an exposition. I am sure you can see this exposition. Exposition, what is exposition? Exposition is how the story is introduced to the reader, the background, because when the story happens, certain details have to be set forth in a proper way, right? Especially the first few pages have to introduce the characters, introduce the basic plot, everything. So, therefore, exposition talks of introducing the plot to the reader in as detailed a manner as possible. Who are the characters involved? What is the overall setting? And then what is this a bird's eye view about what this novel is all about. It's going to be all about. So that's exposition. In other words, the backstory of a character, or if there is any backstory of the character, you can as well give it, or if there is any other relevant information that is required for us to understand the characters and plot, you can present that as well. That's called exposition. The next is rising action. You can see this here, the rising action. The rising action is after the exposition, well, the plot gets slightly sharp. It goes on using series of actions, using series of events. The narrator in this fiction goes on developing the plot, right, using series of events, series of action or series of dialogues. If it is a dialogue based action, then using the dialogue between various characters, the plot gets developed, that is called rising action. It builds the dramatic tension, because as we keep reading through, see, in order to better understand this particular Freytag's pyramid, you can pick up any crime novel or thrillers that you have read, mystery fiction, then it becomes evident, in the rising action, gradually, dramatically a tension is getting built, because a problem is introduced here and how the entire narrative is woven around that problem becomes very important. That is rising action. And the third is climax. You can see the climax here. Okay, climax is the pinnacle of the plot. In fact, that is the acme, the topmost point of the plot, where it is going to take a sharp turn. So, until that point of a time, the plot gets built, and the moment it reaches climax, it is going to take a sharp turn. You can expect that, a kind of a breaking point, a kind of breaking point. That is what is called climax. So from here, there is a change of fate which is ensured, and the problem that has been introduced now requires some kind of a solution. Therefore, the arrival or the beginning point of that solution comes with climax. Then there is falling action, which you can see it here, the falling action, right. So here, after the climax, what happens? The story begins shifting its action towards the direction in which the narrator wants you to go. In other words, the story is about to find, or the problem that was introduced to you after having reached the pinnacle is about to find a solution. That is when you can call it a falling action. And the final one, the denouement or the resolution, is where some kind of solution is presented to the problem that was introduced in exposition, built in rising action, identified as a pinnacle point in climax, and that has the solution to which has been initiated in the falling action, and in the resolution a final solution is given to you. So, generally speaking, this is Freytag's pyramid, and in every fiction that you come across, invariably in some form or the other you will be able to find these elements. So, please take a quicker look at this: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and denouement or resolution. Okay? Because when you read a plot, if you can identify the various points in that fiction, when you read a novel, the various points through which the plot is taken, and if you can identify a Freytag's pyramid in the novel that you are reading, that means you have already become an experienced reader, an experienced student of literature. This is something that we can keep in mind, especially while reading plot. From plot, let us move on to characters. Characters again are, we have already discussed this, they are like people. They are equivalent of people. In the real world, we refer to ourselves as people, right? Individuals and people. In the novel, they are called characters. It is said that a reader lives, in fact, in one of the earlier classes we said a reader lives multiple lives while reading a work of art. How? Because through the various characters. A character is basically anyone who appears in the work of art. Basically it can be people or animals or robo, because in the very first story that we read, the Vixen and the Lioness, you can quickly recall, right? In the Vixen and the Lioness, though they are not people, they are animals, nevertheless they are characters in that world. They are characters in the world, because it is through them that the story unfolds, it is through them that the plot unfurls, and it is through them you can even see a kind of course, in a longish story, you can even identify the Freytag's pyramid. Of course, we are going to discuss another short story after we discuss all these elements. Then we will ask you to identify Freytag's element, various elements of fiction. So, this is something that is very important. So, here is a very if there is an alien that appears, that also becomes a character in the novel, or if it is a robo, even that is also a character in the novel. So, therefore, characters are various people that appear in that fiction through whom story is narrated, through whom events take place. So, they are called characters. Now, here is a beautiful quotation on characters. Somebody says, a critic says that novelist makes up a number of word masses, roughly describing himself, and then gives them names and a sex, assigns them plausible gestures, and causes them to speak by the use of inverted commas and perhaps to behave. These word masses can be called his characters, and they do not come to us in a in a very cold way. They may be created in a beautiful, delirious excitement. That is what a particular critic says about the characters. Now, characterization is very important, because as I said, now look how a particular character is developed. When you read a novel, see the background. The author gives the character a background, a social background, an ethnic background, an historical background, and puts the characteristic features, what are the characteristic traits of that particular character, psychological makeup and his friendship, his attitude towards life, all of them. This is how you build characters. This is how you build characters. So, that is another important element of fiction that you can think of. Okay. After characters come, of course, here you have different types of characters. We said this, right. Generally speaking, a confidante character is somebody, of course, you have the protagonist, the main character, the so called hero or heroine. We no longer use these terms, we call them protagonists. The important characters in a novel or in any fiction is called protagonist. So, they have some people in whom they trust and they speak everything, they are called confidantes, or close friends through whom they reveal whatever they wish to reveal. They are called confidante characters. Dynamic characters are also sometimes called round characters. This is a distinction that E. M. Forster makes in aspects of novel: flat characters and round characters. Flat characters are those characters that do not change throughout the novel. They do not change much. Whatever they are in the beginning, even towards the end they remain the same thing. They are also sometimes called static characters, but there is a slight difference between flat character and static character, but they do not change, that is what you need to keep in mind. And there are dynamic characters, and they are also called round characters. What happens, these round characters undergo a lot of change, a lot of transformation, not necessarily physically. Of course, if it is a Bildungsroman, Roman, that is a particular a technique that a writer uses, wherein a character is taken from his or her childhood through how they grow up and grow old and all that. This type of novel is called a Bildungsroman novel, where a character is traced from its birth towards its later stages of growth. So, yeah, here a character undergoes a lot of transformation, changes, not just physical changes, but even mental changes. It undergoes conflicts, and as a result of which it matures. So, a great novelist focuses on creating robust round characters or dynamic characters. And then you have of course protagonist, we have already discussed it. As opposed to protagonist is antagonist, and in fact if there is a conflict that takes place, it always takes place between the protagonist and the antagonist. And you can also call a villain, there is a villain, of course sometimes villain and antagonist could be the same, whereas in some cases villain is again a kind of a stock character wherein they do not change. Sometimes even an antagonist is also capable of changing. Therefore, protagonist and the antagonist, they are round characters. They have to be essentially dynamic characters. The rest of them, there is not much scope for changing as such. They are called flat characters or stock characters. This is something that you can keep in mind. Of course, there are various other types of characters, but of course you can make it out, right? Yeah. Here are some examples of confidante characters, dynamic characters. In fact, we have taken it up from Harry Potter novel series. So, Hermione for instance or Ron for instance, they are confidante characters, they are close friends of Harry. In fact, Harry confides in both these characters, therefore, we get to know what Harry is thinking, what Harry is planning and all that. They are called confidante characters. You have a dynamic character or a developing character. Harry himself is Harry Potter himself is an example for that. He is also an example for round character. And flat characters are, as I said, they do not change much, especially if you think of Crabbe and Goyle, the so called two friends, idiotic friends of Draco Malfoy, who can be called in a sense an antagonist, not a main antagonist in the novel though. So, they are called, flat characters. His friends, Draco Malfoy's friends are called flat characters. So, we have very many other character types like that. You can easily identify many of them, and a villain, of course, if there is a villain or the antagonist, Voldemort is the antagonist in the Harry Potter series, and he is also a villain to a certain extent. He remains a villain throughout, therefore, you can, though there is a background to him, he remains a villain throughout. So, he clubs the roles of these characters. These are some things that you can keep in mind while discussing characters. The next thing in elements of fiction is conflict. This is again a very important element, because in the absence of conflict, then it loses its relevance. A plot loses its relevance, therefore, conflict can be kept in mind. Conflict can be defined as a struggle between either two individuals or between two entities. If there are two forces, the force of the good and the force of the bad, it can be a conflict, can be, it is like in the Order of Phoenix, you have Dumbledore's army and you have Voldemort's army. So, they stand for the forces of the good and the forces of the bad. So, the conflict takes place between them, alright. So, this is called conflict. And conflict, again, there are different types of conflicts. When a conflict takes place between two different characters, it is called conflict between character and character. If the conflict happens between the protagonist and the society around, because then it is called conflict vis-a-vis nature or natural forces. If you can quickly recall Moby Dick, in fact, here the conflict is between the protagonist and the forces of nature, ocean and the tides and the whale. So, here the conflict happens between the clash between the character and of course, the whale, the white whale. And the other type is character and society. So, here especially if you pick up a writing, for instance, where there is a protagonist that belongs to LGBTQI background, where the entire, they feel, such characters feel the entire society is against them, because they are fighting against the so called dominant ethos of the society. As a result of that, they find themselves pitted against society. You can think of the Ministry of Utmost Happiness that Arundhati Roy has written as an example characterizing this kind of a conflict. Then you have the conflict can come between, let us say, character and machine or technology. In many of the sci-fi movies, you find artificial intelligence pitted against human beings. So, the conflict takes place between them, or aliens and this. In the movie series called Aliens, you have the conflict taking place between human characters and the aliens. So, these are various types of characters, and in sometimes it can as well be, the conflict can as well come from, between the conflict can as well happen between a character and God. They say, for instance, in Book of Job or in Satya Harishchandra, the tale of Satya Harishchandra that you have read, you can see that this is an existential conflict. Though these guys are good, though these guys have followed all the virtuous paths, they undergo conflict, and therefore they start fighting with God, because they do not know what fault they have done. So, it can as well be against God. Or character, when character starts fighting with oneself, or when they start fighting with their alter egos, it can as well be a self versus self. So, many of the Bildungsroman novels, many of the novels that deal with the stream of consciousness technique make use of this particular type of conflict. So, in other words, conflict becomes essential. It can happen in very many ways, all right. The next is setting. Setting is very, very important. In fact, this is what chisels out the plot. This is what chisels out the plot into a kind of a flesh and blood. It's going to add flesh and blood to the skeleton of plot. If plot is a skeleton, then flesh and blood is where settings can add that flesh and blood. Setting is generally where the story takes place, the background. It can be a geographical location. Let us say, for instance, if the story unfolds in Mysore, then Mysore becomes a setting. Or if the story unfolds in 1990s Mysore, then the time in which it is set also becomes a setting, the time. Or if it is set in monsoon, various seasons, right, supposing the entire story takes place in a rainy season, then that rainy season provides the setting to that place. Or a cultural background, the culture in which a particular character is located or the particular story is located, then that one. All these things, that ranging from geographical location to the time setting, the historical location, the cultural location, all these things form the settings, the settings of it. The coordinations of the story, the longitude and the latitude, not just the geographical longitude and the latitude, the mental one, the cultural background, the societal background, all of them provide a setting. That is something that you have to keep in mind. Yeah, after setting comes a theme. Theme is very, very important. Theme is not summary here. Theme is what is the outlook, what is the overall outlook towards life that we find in that work of art. What is the writer's vision that is presented? Okay, what is the vision that is presented? If you can quickly recall, the two stories, short stories that we have read. In one case, it was detachment, how the concept of detachment that a monk should develop. It is not the physical detachment that the monk talks of, it is more of a resignation, a philosophical resignation, disinterestedness, the philosophical disinterestedness is something there. And in the case of Vixen, quality is important than the quantity. That is a kind of a moral, but you can consider moral also as part of theme, the overall outlook towards life, the underlying value systems, and what is the final vision that the writer wishes to communicate. All these things come under theme, So, these are some things that you can keep in mind. Generally speaking, when you say theme, you have a coming of age or circle of life, prejudice, greed, good versus evil, the process of growing up oneself, and how does a particular character fight against all the odds and still emerge victorious. All these things are broadly speaking theme, but even within that, a broader philosophical outlook towards life becomes important in theme. Okay. From theme, we go on to point of view. This is again very important. Generally speaking, point of view is who is narrating, the narrating persona, who is narrating this. Generally speaking, there are 2 points of view that most of the writer make use of. One is called the first person narration, the other one is called the third person narration. First person is I, we, us, this is first person narration. So, if a particular novel begins with I want to do this way, I feel like this, these are my enemies, these are my odds, very clearly that novel is making use of the first person narration. Okay. In other words, one of the characters, generally the protagonist, starts revealing what happens to him or her through narrating it. That is what is called first person narration. All right. And the third person narration is usually when, as if I told you, right, supposing there is an overall observer, maybe you can call it third person narration also as an omniscient narration. We have used this term earlier in one of the earlier classes, right. So, we said that here, as if the writer knows everything, as if the narrator knows what all is happening in that fictional world, they start narrating, like introducing. When Harry went here, he discovered to his great surprise that he did not lose all that he thought he had lost. Instead, there was something very precious. So, somebody is talking about Harry. So, this kind of narration is called third person narration, because they know, or that person, the narrator knows as if something is happening to this particular character, and even they can even enter the head of particular characters and start describing what they are feeling. So, this type of narration is called third person narration or omniscient narration. Of course, there is also second person narration, but it is rarely used. The second person is like you, using you. So, something like you go to the platform at 10 o'clock, you are about to a train is about to come at 10:30, you board the train and you get down at this particular place. So, everything here unfolds through the use of you. So, the moment you spot it, then that becomes a second person narration. So, I am sure now it has given you some idea. Of course, this class has given you some idea about point of view, right. It is important narrative technique, because who is narrating, according to who is narrating this point of view is determined, something that you can please keep in mind. And finally, tone and style. Tone is something what is the tone? Of course, it depends on the context, because tone is called an emotional coloring, the emotional meaning attributed to language, or the overall attitude of the protagonist, overall attitude of the narrator here becomes important. What is the overall tone here? Is it one of ironic? Is it one of detachment? Is it one of is it one of arrogance? Is it one of humility, humble? So, these are the various things that come under tone, intimate thing, comic thing, funny thing, ironic thing, desperation, resigned attitude, all of them come under tone. And finally is style. Style is something that is a little more complex, because only when you have read enough would we be able to identify the overall style. In order for us to understand style, we need to know how language is used, how characters are arranged, if there is a particular way in which they are arranged, because if you keep reading J.K. Rowling, the style in which she writes, the style in which she introduces the characters. So, when you are familiar with a particular writer, that is when you start identifying the style. The peculiar characteristic traits that reveal who the writer is, what kind of genre that particular novel belongs to. Because if it is a crime thriller, you can, by the very use of certain words, you can identify the style and say that it belongs to historical fiction, it belongs to mystery, it belongs to some other form. So, style is related to that, closely related to the choice of the word. So, these are some things that you can keep in mind, and I am sure this class has given you enough ideas about various elements of fiction. Always remember, an active understanding of various elements of fiction will give you an advantage when it comes to analyzing fiction and understanding fiction in a little more detailed manner. All right. In the next class, we will come up with something else, but before that, here is a very quick activity for you. Based on your understanding of the Freytag model and based on your understanding of various elements of fiction, here is an activity for you. So, what you can do, here is a very beautiful short story by William Somerset Maugham. It is called The Appointment in Samara. It is a retold version. So, you can take a quick screenshot of this. Death speaks. In fact, Death here acts as a protagonist. Death is considered as a feminine, as a woman here. She starts speaking. So, look at the short story and see if you can identify various points through which plot is developed: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action and resolution in the short story. And the second thing is, see if you can spot the various elements of fiction that we have discussed in the class today. So, if you have successfully answered both of them, then I am sure you have understood both the plot in a detailed way and also elements of fiction in a wonderful way. All right. Thank you. We will see you in the next class with some more aspects of fiction. Thank you very much.